Canada's potash power has become one of the quietest pressure points in the entire US-Canada trade fight. If you buy groceries, run a farm, invest in food companies, or care about prices at the store, this hidden mineral can reach straight into your wallet. Washington is threatening tariffs to show strength, but the country sitting on the supply may have more leverage than most Americans realize. And the proof is not in a speech, it is buried in the numbers. The first alarming fact is this: Canada is not just a supplier of potash. Canada is the supplier that American agriculture cannot easily replace. In 2024, the US Geological Survey estimated Canada produced 15 million tons of potash, measured as potassium oxide equivalent. The United States produced only 420,000 tons. That is not a small gap. That is not a normal trade imbalance. That is one country operating as a global fertilizer power, while the other country, despite having one of the largest farm economies on Earth, remains deeply dependent on imports. This matters because potash is not a luxury input. It is not something farmers buy only when prices are low. Potash delivers potassium, one of the nutrients crops need to grow, fight stress, build strong roots, and produce yields. Corn needs it, soybeans need it, wheat needs it, canola needs it, potatoes need it. Without potassium, the plant does not simply become less efficient. The crop weakens, the yield suffers, the soil gets drained, the food chain feels it later. And here is the part that should alarm Washington. The US Geological Survey says there is no real substitute for potassium as an essential plant nutrient. You can change suppliers, you can delay purchases, you can shop for a different fertilizer blend, but you cannot tell a corn plant to replace potassium with a political slogan. You cannot tariff your way around chemistry. That is why this dispute is bigger than one tariff line. It is bigger than one border fight. It is bigger than one talking point about bringing production home. The United States can argue about trade policy all day, but crops do not negotiate. Soil does not care who won the press conference. Farmers still need nutrients before the planting window closes. The second fact is even more direct. The United States is overwhelmingly dependent on imported potash. USGS put U.S. net import reliance at 93% of apparent consumption. And for the years 2020 through 2023, Canada accounted for 79% of U.S. potash import sources. Russia was far behind at 11%. Belarus was listed at 4%. Israel and others made up smaller shares. That means when Washington talks about tariffs on Canadian potash, it is not pressuring some distant foreign competitor that American farmers can easily avoid. It is putting a cost on the main supply line. It is taxing the bridge that U.S. agriculture is already standing on. This is the part many people miss. Tariffs are often sold as a way to punish the foreign seller, but in a market where the buyer has few fast alternatives, the cost often moves down the chain. Importers pay more. Distributors pay more. Retail fertilizer prices can rise. Farmers face higher input bills, and because many farmers sell into commodity markets, they often cannot simply raise their crop price to cover the extra cost. They take the hit first. The third fact is that the 2025 tariff fight did not happen in a vacuum. The US first moved toward broad 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, with separate treatment for energy. Then the policy shifted. By March, the White House said goods that qualified under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement could remain tariff-free, while non-USMCA goods would face 25%, and non-USMCA energy and potash would face a lower 10% tariff. That sounds technical. But the political meaning is simple. Potash was important enough to be carved out. It was important enough that the rate was reduced. It was important enough that policymakers understood a full tariff shock could hit American farmers at the wrong time. And that is the irony. The same policy meant to show U.S. toughness also revealed U.S. exposure. If Canadian potash were truly easy to replace, there would be no need to treat it carefully. If American agriculture had plenty of domestic supply, the tariff would be a clean pressure tool. But the carve-out itself sent a signal. Washington knew this was not like taxing a luxury product. This was touching a core farm input. The fourth fact is where Saskatchewan enters the story. Canada's potash power is not spread evenly across the country. It is concentrated in one province. Saskatchewan is the engine. The Library of Parliament's Hill Notes analysis described Canada as the world's largest potash producer, with its active mines located in Saskatchewan, and it noted that more than 90% of Canadian potash production is exported. Think about what that means. In a global food system under pressure from war, sanctions, climate shocks, shipping delays, and inflation, one Canadian province sits on a resource that feeds crops across continents. Saskatchewan is not just producing another commodity. It is exporting yield. It is exporting food security. It is exporting leverage. And the US is the biggest customer. In 2024, Canada exported about 22.8 million tons of potassium chloride, and the United States bought roughly 12.1 million tons. Brazil came next at 3.1 million tons. China bought 1.4 million tons. Indonesia and India each bought around 1.2 million tons. That is the hidden strategic fact behind the trade fight. Canada's largest potash customer is the United States, but the United States is not Canada's only customer. There are other buyers. Brazil needs fertilizer for soybeans, corn, sugarcane, and coffee. China needs fertilizer to protect food supply for a massive population. India needs it. Indonesia needs it. Global agriculture does not stop at the US border. So when people ask whether Canada has leverage, the answer is yes, but with a major caution. Canada has leverage because it has a product the US needs and the world wants. But that does not mean Canada has formally cut off supply. It has not. Talk of restricting exports or using potash as a weapon remains political pressure, not implemented national policy. That distinction matters. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media covers the full picture, the moment to understand it may have already passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. The fifth fact is the one every American farmer understands immediately. The main danger is not an instant empty warehouse. The main danger is higher cost. Analysts and industry groups have warned that tariffs on fertilizer imports can raise farm input bills, and RBC noted that fertilizers can account for roughly 30% to 45% of a U.S. farmer's annual operating cost, depending on the crop. RBC also pointed to rising U.S. farm cost indexes in 2025, with fertilizer playing a major role in the pressure on crop farmers. That changes the whole story. This is not only about whether fertilizer exists, it is about whether farmers can buy it at a price that still lets them survive the season. A farmer does not make money because the crop grew. A farmer makes money on the difference between the cost of growing the crop and the price received after harvest. If seed costs rise, fuel costs rise, equipment costs rise, interest costs rise, and fertilizer costs rise, the farmer's margin can disappear long before the consumer sees the final price on a grocery shelf. And fertilizer is not something farmers can always skip. Some can adjust application rates, some can delay, some can use soil testing to target more carefully. But across a major farm economy, cutting back too much on potassium risks yield losses later. That means the farmer gets trapped between two bad choices: pay more now or risk producing less later. For American viewers, that is the pocketbook connection. This is not a remote mineral story from Saskatchewan. This is the cost of corn in Iowa. It is the cost of soybeans in Illinois. It is the cost of wheat in Kansas. It is the cost of potatoes in Idaho. And eventually, through feed, processing, transport, and retail, it can become part of the cost pressure moving through the food system. For Canadian viewers, the story looks different, but just as serious. Potash is a source of national strength. It supports jobs, exports, provincial revenue, rail shipments, port activity, and Canada's place in global food security. But when your biggest customer is also your closest ally and largest trading partner, a tariff fight becomes more than economics. It becomes a test of trust. The sixth fact is that replacing Canada quickly is not realistic. Yes, the United States has potash resources. USGS describes domestic production in New Mexico and Utah, and it identifies other resource areas in places like Montana, North Dakota, Utah, Arizona, and Michigan. But resources in the ground are not the same as fertilizer on a truck headed to a co-op before planting season. A mine is not built by signing a statement. It takes exploration, permitting, financing, engineering, construction, processing facilities, rail links, environmental review, skilled labor, and years of execution. Fertilizer Canada told Farms.com that increasing fertilizer production can take 10 to 15 years, and it argued that U.S. reserves are not enough to meet domestic demand. That is the time problem. Tariffs work on a political clock. Farming works on a seasonal clock. Mining works on a decade clock, and those clocks do not line up. A president can announce tariffs in a single afternoon. A farmer can lose a planting window in a matter of weeks. A new potash mine can take a decade or more to become a reliable source of supply. So when officials say we can make it here, the honest response is not never. The honest response is not fast enough to solve this year's problem, and maybe not fast enough to solve the next several years either. The seventh fact is that the alternative suppliers are complicated. Russia is a major producer, but relying more heavily on Russian supply carries obvious political risk in the middle of continuing geopolitical tension. Belarus has been hit by sanctions, and USGS noted that the European Union and the United States placed sanctions on the state-run Belarusian potash exporter after 2022, with Belarusian export routes disrupted compared with earlier levels. That leaves Washington in a difficult position. If it wants to reduce dependence on Canada, where does it go? Russia? Belarus? More distant suppliers at higher shipping cost, countries with smaller export capacity, markets where other buyers are already competing. This is why potash is not like switching from one brand of phone charger to another. The supply map is narrow. The biggest reliable source for the United States is right across the northern border. It is close, it is established, it moves through known channels. It comes from an ally. That is exactly why tariffs on it are so risky. The eighth fact is about reserves. USGS estimated Canada's potash reserves at 1.1 billion tons of potassium oxide equivalent. The United States was listed at 220 million tons. Canada's reserves are roughly 5 times larger, and its 2024 production was more than 30 times larger than US production. That is not just a production gap, that is a power gap. Countries do not only gain leverage from armies, oil fields, chip factories, or banking systems. They also gain leverage from boring things that the world cannot live without. Fertilizer is one of those things. It does not dominate cable news every night. It does not trend like a scandal. But without it, modern yields fall, food systems tighten, and politicians start hearing from farmers very quickly. That is why Canada's potash position should alarm Washington. Not because Canada is about to shut the border tomorrow, not because Ottawa has announced a formal cutoff. It has not. But because the structure of the market gives Canada a kind of quiet power that does not need to be shouted to be real. Power is not always a threat. Sometimes power is simply being the place everyone has to call when the season begins. The ninth fact is that Canada's fertilizer role goes beyond potash. The Fertilizer Institute said Canada supplies U.S. growers with nearly 10% of their nitrogen fertilizer needs, accounts for 25% of total U.S. nitrogen fertilizer imports, and supplies nearly 20% of sulfur consumed by U.S. farmers and others. That means the U.S.-Canada fertilizer relationship is not one narrow pipeline. It is a network. Potash is the most striking example because U.S. dependence is so high, but nitrogen and sulfur also matter. Nitrogen drives plant growth. Sulfur supports protein formation and crop quality. Fertilizer is a system, and the North American food economy is built around cross-border flows. This is where the tariff fight becomes dangerous. Policymakers often talk as though imports are weakness and domestic production is strength. Sometimes that is true, but in North America, supply chains were built over decades to treat the continent as a shared production platform. Canada sends potash south, the United States sends other agricultural inputs north. Fertilizer moves, grain moves, livestock feed moves, machinery moves, energy moves. Ports and railways connect it all. If you suddenly tax parts of that system, you do not just punish the other country, you shake the platform beneath your own producers. Do you think tariffs on Canadian fertilizer are a necessary push to rebuild U.S. production, or are they political pressure that lands first on American farmers? That is the real debate, because both sides can claim they are defending agriculture, but only one side has to pay the bill before planting. The 10th fact is the most politically uncomfortable one. Some of the loudest claims in this debate go too far. It is not accurate to say Canada can easily devastate U.S. agriculture overnight. It is not proven that tariffs alone will cause runaway food prices. It is not responsible to pretend every farm will collapse because of one policy change. Agriculture is more complex than that. But it is also not credible to shrug this off as nothing. The numbers show real exposure. The import reliance is real. The Canadian share is real. The lack of a substitute for potassium is real. The time needed to expand production is real. The farmer cost pressure is real. The sanctions risk around other suppliers is real. That is what makes this story powerful. The most serious version of the argument does not need exaggeration. It does not need panic. It does not need a fake secret plan. The basic facts are enough. Canada has the resource. The United States needs the resource. Tariffs make the resource more expensive. Replacing it quickly is not practical. And the cost lands in the one place Washington says it wants to protect: the American farm economy. The political problem for Washington is that farmers are not abstract voters. They are organized, they understand input costs, they know when policy raises their bills, they know the difference between a promise of future domestic production and a fertilizer invoice due now. A tariff can be announced as national strength, but when that tariff raises the cost of a crop input imported from an ally, it can look very different from the cab of a tractor. For Republicans, this creates a strategic tension. Many rural voters support stronger borders, tougher trade policy, and more domestic manufacturing. But those same voters also need affordable inputs. If the policy meant to defend them raises their costs before an election cycle, the politics can get messy quickly. For Democrats, the issue offers a different opening. They can frame the tariff fight as proof that aggressive trade policy hurts consumers and farmers, but they also face their own challenge. Voters are skeptical of any party that sounds too comfortable with dependence on foreign supply. So the smarter argument is not imports are always good. The smarter argument is do not punish your own farmers while you build domestic capacity. For Canada, the political pressure runs in the opposite direction. Canadian leaders cannot look weak in a trade fight with Washington. When the US threatens tariffs, Canadian politicians face pressure to respond. Some may talk about restricting exports, using critical minerals, or targeting politically sensitive US sectors. Ontario Premier Doug Ford floated hardline ideas in the broader tariff fight, but talk is not the same as a national potash cutoff. The difference matters. Saskatchewan also has its own interest. Potash means jobs, investment, revenue, and global standing. A full disruption with the US would not be painless for Canada. The United States is the largest customer. Rail and logistics are built around that trade. Companies want predictability, miners want stable demand, provincial leaders want leverage, but they do not want to damage the industry that gives them leverage. So the real Canadian strategy is likely not to shut off supply. The real strategy is to remind Washington that Canada has options. That is where export diversification becomes important. If Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and other markets are all major buyers or potential growth markets, Canada can gradually reduce its vulnerability to US pressure. It does not have to do it overnight. It only has to prove that over time, the United States is not the only destination. This is the hidden danger for Washington. A tariff fight may not produce an instant crisis. It may produce a slower change. Canadian producers and policymakers may look for more long-term deals outside the United States. Global buyers may try to lock in supply. Rail and port planning may shift. Investment decisions may reflect a world where the US market is big but politically unstable. And once supply chains adjust, they are not always easy to pull back. That is why the BHP Jansen project matters, but also why it should not be oversold. BHP's huge Saskatchewan potash project is meant to add future capacity, and Hill Notes described it as a major new mine expected to boost Canadian production once fully operational. But Reuters later reported that BHP delayed Jansen's first production timeline while costs surged, showing that even in Canada, major potash expansion is hard, expensive, and uncertain. That detail changes the story. Canada has the advantage, but it is not magic. Mines still face cost inflation. Construction delays happen, labor matters, capital discipline matters, global prices matter. If demand weakens, projects slow. If costs rise, timelines slip. So Canada's power is real, but it is not unlimited. The same is true for the United States. The US is exposed, but it is not helpless. It can encourage domestic production where practical. It can support fertilizer innovation. It can improve rail and storage resilience. It can help farmers use nutrients more efficiently. It can build strategic relationships with multiple suppliers. It can negotiate smarter exemptions instead of using broad threats. but none of that changes the immediate math. In the near term, US farmers depend on Canadian potash. There is also a global food security angle. Potash demand is tied to crop production in countries that feed the world. Brazil's soybean and corn sectors matter to global feed and oilseed markets. India's food security matters to hundreds of millions of people. China's fertilizer demand affects global pricing. When a trade fight touches potash, it touches a market that does not stay local. This is one reason allies are watching. Canada and the United States are supposed to be among the most integrated partners in the world. They share a border, defense systems, energy networks, auto supply chains, agricultural trade, and intelligence ties. If they cannot keep fertilizer trade stable, what message does that send to Europe, to Asia, to rivals? It tells the world that even friendly borders can become bargaining tables. It tells farmers that input prices can be changed by politics as much as weather. It tells investors that North American integration is not as safe as they thought. And it tells competitors that alliance friction can create openings. Russia and Belarus do not need to win a propaganda war if North America voluntarily makes its own fertilizer supply more expensive. China does not need to control Canadian potash to benefit from a weakened US-Canada trade relationship. Brazil does not need to choose sides to understand that Canadian supply has value. The world simply watches the two allies argue, then adjusts. That is why this story should not be framed as Canada versus America in a childish way. The real issue is whether North America can manage strategic resources without harming its own farmers. There is a counter-argument, and it deserves to be heard. Supporters of tariffs say the United States must stop relying so heavily on foreign sources for critical inputs. They argue that tariffs can create incentives for domestic investment. They say short-term pain may be worth long-term resilience. They also argue that trade partners should not assume permanent access to the US market without conditions. That argument has emotional force. A country as large as the United States does not want to be dependent forever. Food security is national security. Fertilizer security is part of food security. On that point, tariff supporters are not wrong to raise the question. But here is where the argument weakens. A tariff is not a mine. A tariff is not a processing plant. A tariff is not a trained workforce. A tariff is not a rail network. A tariff does not create potassium in the soil. If the policy raises costs before alternatives exist, then it becomes a tax on vulnerability, not a cure for it. A smarter resilience policy would start with the bottleneck and timeline. What can be produced domestically? How long will it take? What permits are needed? What investment is realistic? What can be stored? What can be diversified through allies? What can farmers do to improve nutrient efficiency without sacrificing yield? What should be exempt from tariffs while that transition happens? That is the difference between strategy and theater. Strategy builds capacity before it burns bridges. Theater announces pressure first and worries about the supply chain later. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. Now look at the farm gate. A farmer planning a season does not have the luxury of waiting for Washington and Ottawa to finish their argument. Fertilizer decisions happen before harvest. Many inputs are bought months ahead. Financing is arranged, equipment is prepared, crop insurance choices are made, seed goes into the ground whether politics is settled or not. If potash costs rise, the farmer has to decide. Apply the full amount and hope crop prices hold, cut back and risk yield, delay and risk missing the agronomic window, take on more debt, switch crops. None of these choices are simple, and once millions of acres are involved, small cost changes become huge. A modest increase per ton can turn into a major bill across a large operation. A major increase can change planting decisions across regions. That does not mean grocery prices explode the next day. Food pricing has many layers. But it does mean pressure enters the system early, at the soil level. That is why the phrase hidden strategic weapon is tempting. Potash looks like a weapon because it gives Canada leverage, but it is more accurate to call it a strategic dependency. Canada does not need to weaponize potash for Washington to feel exposed. The exposure exists because the US farm economy already relies on the supply, and that dependency was not created overnight. It was built by geology, economics, trade policy, infrastructure, and decades of integrated concentrated North American agriculture. Canada had the reserves. Saskatchewan developed the mines. U.S. farmers needed the product. Trade made sense. The system worked because both sides treated each other as reliable partners. The tariff fight challenges that assumption. If the United States treats Canadian fertilizer as a target, Canada will ask whether the U.S. market is still dependable. If Canada talks about export restrictions, American farmers will ask whether Canada is still a safe supplier. Trust can erode faster than production can shift. And in fertilizer, trust is part of supply security. This is the real alarm bell for Washington. Not that Canada will suddenly cut off potash tomorrow, not that U.S. agriculture will collapse. The alarm bell is that the United States has placed political pressure on a supply chain where it has limited short-term leverage and high domestic exposure. That is not strength, that is risk. For Canada, the lesson is different. Potash gives Canada bargaining power, but power must be handled carefully. If Ottawa or provincial leaders push too hard, they could damage relationships with U.S. farmers who are not the ones writing tariff policy. They could also encourage Washington to accelerate alternatives, even if those alternatives take years. Canada's best argument is not to threaten chaos. It is to show reliability, capacity, and the cost of taking that reliability for granted. For the United States, the lesson is also clear. If food security is national security, then fertilizer policy cannot be built around sudden threats. It has to be built around capacity, allied trust, and realistic timelines. The current tension reveals a contradiction at the heart of American trade politics. Washington wants to be less dependent on foreign suppliers, but it is willing to use tariffs before domestic replacement exists. It wants to protect farmers, but it risks raising their input costs. It wants to project toughness, but the market numbers show dependence on Canada. That contradiction is what makes this story so important. The facts do not say Canada can destroy U.S. agriculture. The facts say the United States has a serious exposure in one of the most basic inputs in modern farming. They say Canada's potash dominance is real. They say Saskatchewan sits at the center of a global fertilizer network. They say potassium cannot be replaced as a plant nutrient. They say new production takes years. They say tariffs can raise costs before they create capacity. And they say Washington should think carefully before turning an ally's strength into an American farmer's bill. So the main tension is now resolved. Canada's potash power is not a myth, and Washington's exposure is not just political spin. But the next question is more dangerous. If fertilizer can become leverage between allies, what other hidden supply chains are waiting to be pulled into the trade war? In my next video, I am covering how Canada's critical minerals and energy exports could become the next pressure point against Washington. And what I found will change how you see this.